Um, so, welcome everyone to the inaugural Professor Brij Gopal Memorial Lecture, and we're very happy to put together this lecture today, this remote lecture, in memory of Professor Brij Gopal, who passed away earlier this year, but left behind a towering legacy for all of us to follow, for all of us to learn from. He was one of India's foremost ecologists and foremost wetland and river ecologists. And at India Rivers Forum, Professor Brij Gopal has been associated with us from the very beginning since 2014, and which gives us even more pleasure in announcing the beginning of this river lecture, which will happen annually on World Water Day every year on 22nd March, in honor of Professor Brij Gopal. And on top of that, uh, it's also great to have our first river lecture in the name of Professor Brij Gopal being given by one of his former students, Professor Somnath Bandyopadhyay. So I'll request Professor Somnath Bandyopadhyay, who's currently at Nalanda University, to begin the lecture. And at the same time, I'll request everyone else to try and keep their uh, videos off if you face difficulties in audio quality, and to keep your audios off at all times except that of the speaker. So, Professor Bandyopadhyay.
Thank you, Siddharth. Uh, Namaskar, one and all who have come today to honor Professor Brij Gopal as much as uh, work towards uh, rivers, rejuvenation of rivers, and maintenance of the river ecosystems. It's a great honor and privilege as a former student of Professor Brij Gopal, one who has been trained. And therefore, I think whatever I speak today will be a kind of a reflection of the thoughts which I have imbibed from Professor Brij Gopal, some of it directly, some of it indirectly, and that will be coming into the lecture as we speak. So, without much ado, let me start. My talk today is entitled Floods, Floodplains, and Wetland Ecosystems, a perspective from the Indian subcontinent. The reason I thought about floods, floodplains, is it reminds me of the third State of Environment report of the Center for Science and Environment, the floods, floodplains, and environmental myths, which was inaugurated in Delhi. And I accompanied Dr. Brij Gopal into that ceremony where Mr. Anil Agarwal was there. So it is a kind of a remembrance in that sense. And I thought it might just bring back certain memories which are so important. So let me begin. Floods, floodplains, and wetland ecosystems. Floods are natural disasters. That is what we learn. I think it was in middle school when we learned that the river Damodar was the sorrow of Bengal. It flooded too often, created misery, we were told by our geography teacher. She also explained how the 4 multipurpose dams at Maithan, Panchet, Tilaiya, and Konar, constructed during the 50s by the Damodar Valley Corporation, a mega multipurpose river valley project modeled on the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States, has ended the scourge. As impressionable children, we had heaved a sigh of relief. As we navigated high school, we also came to know of the river Kosi as the sorrow of Bihar, which is how it is still referred in the school textbooks of the state. Indeed, almost every Indian state seems to have a river that is their sorrow, be it the Brahmaputra in Assam, Mahanadi in Orissa, or even Doni in Karnataka. We even learnt of China's sorrow, the Yellow River, although in passing. So floods are indeed common in most Asian rivers, and we all have some form of personal experience or familiarity with floods that has shaped our own perceptions towards the phenomenon. Indeed, I was myself a victim of floods as a child, thanks to a breached embankment of the river Tista in the northern district of Jalpaiguri in West Bengal in the year 1968. Vivid images of struggle and survival have remained etched in my memory ever since. So these individual experiences coalesce into collective embarrassment as we feed on screaming headlines and graphic portrayal of misery in the wake of floods. We begin to ask, are we to remain helpless in the face of natural disasters such as floods? And our collective will then finds expression through government action in the form of river regulation. Structures are designed and constructed to constrain the flows and contain the waters in designated reservoirs and channels. River regulation, however, is a trade-off between the devil and the deep sea. If the linear flow is... Hello?
Sorry, Professor, please continue.
Is it okay?
Yes, it was the new participant, sorry.
Okay. So river regulation, however, is a trade-off between the devil and the deep sea. If the linear flow is regulated, the horizontal flow increases. And if the horizontal flow is regulated, in Indian conditions, the river bed rises. Right.
You've got muted, unfortunately. Somehow. We can't hear you.
Yeah, okay. I think it got muted. So if the linear flow is regulated, the horizontal flow increases. And if the horizontal flow is regulated, in Indian conditions, the river bed rises. Even so, the frequency of the floods, such as those on the Damodar, certainly decline, lending credence to the river regulation activities. Moreover, new trade-offs emerge. Reduction in the frequency of floods is often accompanied by an increased intensity of the floods, like the ones we witnessed in the Kosi in 2008. Greater regulation is necessary, is what we conclude, before embarking on the next project. And the cycle goes on until it is constrained by either resources for an unbelievably large project that is proposed, or geopolitics, which is often in the form of international boundaries. So these constraints are deemed as fresh challenges that must be overcome by a developing economy or a more resolute government. So budget allocations are raised, capacity building efforts are renewed, and possibility of any fresh perspective is dismissed in technocratic jargon that serve to maintain and strengthen the status quo. The language of disasters is proving to be the proverbial golden goose, sustaining an entire ecosystem of disaster enterprise that flourish on the strength of creative expressions. Floods and the Asian civilizations. Consider some of these facts, again encountered in high school. First, the world's greatest ancient civilizations developed along the banks of Asian rivers, be it South Asia, East Asia, or the Middle East. Not only are these civilizations unbroken, number two, but their prosperity has manifested in some of the highest growth in human population on the planet. And number three, while the Indian culture recognizes the ferocity of occasional floods, rivers are often treated as members of the family with their individual traits and mood swings. Understanding these facts, however, is often a lifetime endeavor. The first clues appeared through a lecture that I attended delivered by Dr. S.Z. Qasim, then director of the National Institute of Oceanography, when we were in Calcutta University. He defined India as a landscape that was naturally bounded by the Himalayas to the north and the oceans to the south. And that was ecologically shaped by the interactions between the two. It took me 2 masters, 1 PhD, and over 3 decades of reflection to unravel the importance of that statement. The Himalayas are not only the youngest mountain ranges on earth, but is vastly different from other mountains, simply because it is a sea floor that has risen to great heights. There are no volcanoes to create igneous rocks, unlike the western coasts of the Americas, for example. And the 50 million years of its existence is geologically not enough for large-scale metamorphosis. So we can imagine our northern borders to be essentially guarded by a huge sand wall that can absorb cannon fire, but remains vulnerable to water flows. The water flows bring us to the most crucial part of our discussion today, the monsoon. Although it conjures images of rain in the popular mind, it actually refers to the oceanic winds that blow in opposite directions during different times of the year, creating distinct seasons. The Arabic roots of the word is mosam, meaning seasons, variously adopted by the Portuguese and Dutch sailors of the 16th century before becoming common in English languages as we know today. While traders have historically used the seasonal reversal of the wind direction to navigate the Arabian Sea, the bulk of the rainfall on the Indian subcontinent is contributed by events in the Bay of Bengal, much of which is still very unclear. Why do we have twice the number of cyclones in the Bay of Bengal as compared to the Arabian Sea? Why are these more intense and often destructive? Part of the answer lies in the anomalies associated with the sea surface temperature, which is generally higher in the Bay of Bengal as compared to the Arabian Sea. However, the sea surface temperature is also cooled periodically by the large volume of water disgorged by the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna river system, along with several other large rivers into the Bay of Bengal. The annual cycle of evaporation and wind movement over the Bay of Bengal is further conditioned by events occurring further away in the mid-Pacific, known to us as the El Nino and Southern Oscillation. So recent evidence is pointing at similar oscillation in the Indian Ocean as well, which further complicate our understanding. So what is clear, however, is that the monsoon rains contribute over 85% of the water in the Ganga River basin, continues to be a major factor in Indian agriculture and to the national GDP growth, and washes the landscape of its waste produced during the year. If India, with less than 4% of the global share of fresh water and less than 2.5% of the land area, is able to sustain 18% of the human population on the planet, the annual monsoons must deserve some credit. The floodplains of Asian rivers have always been populated. These are regions where agriculture surpluses were first created, providing opportunities for mankind to explore their thoughts and express these in creative ways. The thoughts themselves were refined and sharpened through interactions facilitated by dense settlements and sustained by diversified occupations. Such civic interactions created civilizations, and civilizations have defined who we are. So let us look at floodplains and us. The floodplains of Asian rivers are naturally fertile, thanks to the annual monsoon rains that washes the waste accumulated and replenishes the nutrients lost in agricultural production in the form of fertile silt. The second part needs to be understood better. Asian rivers, particularly those that originate in the Himalayas, carry enormous quantities of silt every year that is deposited in the plains. Ganga and Brahmaputra each carry an estimated 400 to 700 million tons of sediment that is creating the youngest landmass in the world in the form of the Sundarbans. So as we speak, there is a landform getting created because of this huge amount of sediment. So agricultural systems are characterized by productivity and monotony, like the prairies and the steppes in the temperate regions of the world. The Indo-Gangetic river system, however, distinguishes itself for far less uniform and predictable in its flooding patterns, responding, as it were, to the unique variability in the monsoon rains of the subcontinent. Shifts in river courses are known to have eliminated an entire civilization along the Indus Valley, wiping in its course amazingly advanced systems of trade, industry, and urban settlements. Although less dramatic, similar shifts in the courses of rivers in the Indo-Gangetic plains have often led to disputes over the possession of fertile lands, creating competitive social and political institutions. Rivers and their floodplains were used as the prime context to craft mythological characters and narratives that people could relate to. Whether it is a Shiva who contained the fury of a descending Ganga, or a Krishna who create an imagery for a joyful life on the floodplains of Yamuna, mythical tales of rivers and floodplains permeate our everyday lives. Yet, mythology and ancient history of the subcontinent also provide enough evidence of strife in the checkered polity of the Indo-Gangetic plains. Particularly, its relations with the control over economic resources are not as easily evident. Communities had to use force to maintain control over transient productive tracts in the floodplains. Communities also had to use elaborate trading skills and systems to stabilize the consequences of extremely variable farm production. And above all, success of communities was linked to institutions of knowledge for expansion and improved control of the productive systems. So living in the floodplains of major Indian rivers was therefore a high-risk, high-gain situation. And the livelihoods portfolio demanded occupational diversification, knowledge expansion, and resilient institutions. One of the key elements of this strategy was to differentiate between regular flood events and occasional catastrophic flood events. The regular floods replenished water and topsoil, enabled biotic exchange between rivers and floodplain wetlands, and offered variety in the lived experience, often celebrated in the form of festivals. Somewhere in the recent past, we lost confidence in our adaptive capabilities and began to bet on our technical capabilities to prevent floods. And this, as we saw earlier, is taking us on a confrontation with the very forces that have shaped our civilizational destiny. Understanding these floodplain wetlands, Professor Brij Gopal introduced me to wetlands through my academic strength, which was marine benthos of Lake Chilka. As I toiled to collect samples from the lake bed and publications from various libraries, I began to appreciate the importance of hydrology and how it governed the ecosystem. It is another matter that the World Bank worked on the hydrologic dimension a decade later and now considers it a major global success story. Wetlands are both productive and diverse ecosystems, and this unique combination is made possible by the hydrologic interconnections. Coastal wetlands like the Lake Chilka are fairly simple in this regard, primarily controlled by freshwater flows from the land and seawater flows from the Bay of Bengal, tempered, of course, by geomorphology, evaporation, precipitation, etc. The floodplain wetlands that I was next introduced to turned out to be more complex, which was non-intuitive, since I knew the complexities created by the salinity gradients in a coastal wetland, which will be missing here. Indeed, looking at the Jamuna floodplains near Noida did not even seem to me to qualify as wetlands as compared to Chilka and Bharatpur. This was the other wetland which we had visited with him early on. So these floodplain wetlands, these were seemingly unimportant puddles, sometimes with abundant leeches, and decidedly uninviting. This is where I spent a good part of the next 3 years and acquired lessons that serve a lifetime. I will illustrate with a couple of points and a couple of examples. Floodplains are termed so because they flood periodically, and the common perception is the lateral spread of surface waters during a flood event. In my field, however, I observed an anomalous flooding of various depressions during periods when the banks were certainly not overflowing. The puzzle was solved quite accidentally one day when I literally saw water spring from the ground. The presence or absence of water in the floodplains correlated neatly with the water level at the Okla barrage just downstream, albeit with a lag period. We had studied the longitudinal and lateral connectivity of a river system through the river continuum concept, the flood pulse concept, but the importance of groundwater connectivity, particularly for floodplain wetlands and regulated rivers of the Indian subcontinent, suddenly became quite clear. Today, as I watch the dying lakes of Haryana, rivers in western UP, or even wetlands in Bihar, I am reminded of the importance of groundwater connectivity. Saving floodplain wetlands, or even the base flow of rivers in India, is related primarily to groundwater management, something we choose to ignore for the most part. Professor Brij Gopal was a hydrobiologist. To him, hydrology was a key factor that shaped lives, primarily of plants, but also of animals. Life history strategies and the impact of hydrologic regimes and hydrologic changes interested him a lot. My second example is from a colleague who was working on zooplankton, copepods actually, in temporary water bodies. These are actually roadside puddles. It was incredible that these temporary, or rather transient water bodies sprung to life with every rainfall event, despite the unpredictability of rains. Trying to reproduce the results in the lab using discarded Horlicks bottles really was initially frustrating, but eventually very revealing. First, it was not the water, but the force of the water splashing the soil that created the right cues for the dormant eggs to respond. And second, while the global literature described copepod life histories with a batch of dormant eggs just before the frozen months, the Indian copepods chose to release such dormant eggs much more frequently to hedge its bets on the rain. Today, as I watch some of the restoration events and efforts, be it in urban wetlands or streams in arid areas, I feel reassured that with a little help, our indigenous species will be able to demonstrate their innate resilience and repopulate these habitats. Now let's look at ecology in water policy. I would say Professor Brij Gopal was deeply in love with floodplain wetlands and by extension, the river systems of the country. At times, it seemed ridiculous the extent to which he would go to flatter his beloved. Nonetheless, he realized the inherent strength in the ecological reasoning in water management. Perhaps he was foreseeing the emergence of a new water management paradigm that is rooted in ecological knowledge as the basis of sustainability. I met Professor Brij Gopal in professional settings twice during the past 6 years since I returned to academics. One was international and the other was a national. So we were in the same session of a conference organized by the International River Foundation in Delhi, discussing approaches to e-flows, on which he has a book as well. And we were approaching it from two ends. I was approaching from an economic angle and he from the ecological angle. We had our professional differences, which came to head in one of the meetings organized by TEEB India in Delhi at the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change earlier, where he spoke on the ecosystem services from the Ken River. Today, as we take a concrete step towards the Ken-Betwa link, my thoughts stray to the basic understanding of hydrology and ecology. And I cannot help but wonder if the proposed link will not be an ecological disruption. Or maybe we are destined to go through the cycle of regulation and deregulation, followed by restoration and rejuvenation in the larger interests or the societal interests of the day. Perhaps we are destined to play catch up, do the same mistakes that others have done, learn the same lessons all over again, and then voila, we find the answers. So even as the advanced nations are rediscovering the value of their free-flowing rivers and associated wetlands, for which they are willing to pay a hefty price, discovering nature's benefits to mankind and embark on green infrastructure, we remain hostage to a narrow, alien view of ourselves and our rivers. Consider the following. First, India has a unique hydrologic regime. It is indeed surprising that while we do know that there are sharp spikes in rainfall and associated runoff during some parts of the year, we continue to claim the river's natural pathways for human habitation and other development needs. The rivers need their own room. And if people encroach upon it, floods show no mercy while forcibly evacuating them. Second, floods in the Himalayan foothills are not just about water. They are indeed more mud than water. And this is another unique feature of our floods. The sediment that washed down may seem like a problem to those tasked with regulating rivers, but we forget that this is how the Gangetic Plains were created in the first place, enabling one of the world's oldest civilizations to flourish. Third, floods remain a civilizational paradox for Indians, simply because we do not distinguish between regular floods and occasional disastrous floods. And as we begin to combat all floods, we create a new vocabulary that loosely use the word disaster, that often equate wetlands and wastelands, and that have a different connotation for the word drain that was not intended by the native speakers of the English language. So, what do we do? Professor Brij Gopal would have answered in one word: educate. An education that does not view all floods as disasters. An education that prioritizes the humility of resilience over the arrogance of management. An education that connects us to our lived experiences rather than eulogize distant ecological understanding that is largely irrelevant to our landscape. As the world begins to value water today, we need to feel confident that our civilizational values have equated water with life itself. What could be more valuable? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Somnath. That was very enlightening. I'm sure we will take some time to absorb all the information that you've shared. So many interesting points that you've raised, including the idea of language, the power of language, how we relate to our landscapes and riverscapes, and the belief in our own civilizational values as opposed to blindly adopting future foreign values. And I think we will take these ideas with us. Uh, we'll take some questions from
Sure.
people in the audience. We have a comment from, I think, your student Tatsam, uh, who says, and Professor Bandyopadhyay introduced me to wetlands. Great to see 3 generations of knowledge transfer. At this moment, I'll ask others to please put their questions in the chat box. Um, Arun Dikshit asks, you talked about rivers, linear flow, horizontal flow, and riverbed rising. That is interesting. But these 3 aspects are transformed with one engineering solution, that is river linking. How do you see this threatening the river ecosystem? Professor Brij Gopal was very critical about this.
Yeah, I think you gave the one word answer. I think if you look at it from an ecological perspective, so I'll come at it in a couple of ways. If I come, because I have been through the development professionalism as well. So I have seen poverty, I have worked towards working on using water to alleviate poverty as well. And as a young professional, I often felt that the poorer parts of India is rich in water, and the richer parts of India is poorer in terms of water. So it makes eminent sense to make an exchange there. So if only people are willing to share some of the water, and the money could go in the other direction, what's wrong in it? So as a thought, as an idea, might be wonderful. And some of it has already begun to happen in some parts of the country. Uh, but if you look at it from an ecological perspective, then the scenario dramatically changes. So it depends on what are my priorities. And at the end of the day, I think the question is, how does society balance their priorities in a given time? So at this point of time, yes, we need water for human development. And at the same time, we also need some of the ecosystem services. So we cannot impair the ecosystems to a point where the same human beings whom we are trying to improve and develop, they themselves, we are undercutting, we are cutting the bough on which we are sitting. So that should not happen. So where exactly is a line of no return? So, which is a wonderful thinking of when we think of the e-flow concept. So, what is the degree of river regulation, and how does it balance with the degree of ecosystem degradation? So, what does the curve look like, and where are we on that curve? How can we manage our uh, balancing act? And this is something that needs us to not only be very good ecologists, but we also have to be very good social scientists. We have to be very good uh, economists. We have to understand different dimensions, different domains, and then talk to each other. And that is where the language comes back once again. So we need to communicate with each other.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that extensive answer. I think because there's so many perspectives to this, and also the fact that you mentioned in your lecture about free-flowing rivers as a global concept that's also existent. There's a question, comment from Manoj Mishra ji, who says, "Please share if you have looked at it as to how Damodar Valley interventions have come back to haunt us, where the dams are creating disastrous floods while attenuating welcome low-level floods."
Well, I have not really looked at it. I grew up in that belt as a child, and that is the reason I did talk about it. And now I don't see any of the rivers really. So when I do travel, I do see Tilaya Dam or Maithan Dam once in a while. That's filled with water at times. But I've also seen times in which it's almost empty. So again, the question is, it is not what you see on the surface. It is the link that you don't see. What is underground? What's happening underground? And this is where I think we are missing out the critical link. So we will have rivers only when the base flow is maintained. We will have reservoirs only when the groundwater extraction. We think that it is somewhere else. No, it is the same water that is coming connected in many ways.
Right. Thank you. And also for highlighting the importance of groundwater, something that we don't see and we don't really appreciate in a larger context. Um, I don't see any more questions here. Anybody else who might want to unmute themselves and ask a question? No comments, please, only if you have a question.
Yar,
Yes,
I'd
Ravi.
like to try and pose a question.
Okay.
Dr. Bandyopadhyay, first of all, thank you for a wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Um, I don't know how to frame this question, okay? It's a very nebulous thing in my mind. Somewhere I recall reading that the sediments that the rivers bring to the Bay of Bengal, they influence the ocean's chemistry, and that in turn influences the climate or the weather pattern. Can you shed some light on this?
Well, I'm also not a marine chemist in that sense, but I have begun to look into these dimensions. As I mentioned, a couple of things. The water is changing the salinity as well as the sea surface temperature, and that is an important dimension in changing the climate. The sediment is actually expanding the landscape in that area and also leading to the nutrients, which is enriching the downstream development of the ecosystems, including the plankton, the fisheries, sustaining the fisheries, and all of that. So uh, I would think that even these nutrients that are being washed out from the Ganga, Brahmaputra, Meghna might be the reason why we have fascinating coral reefs in Andamans and Nicobars. So uh, these are long range connections. And these long range connections, how they actually work, is very difficult to actually understand. But Ravi, this is a very interesting point that you are raising. So I think our understanding is very fragmentary. Our understanding of how it connects with the El Nino factor, how it connects to various other mechanisms that is happening, is very, very rudimentary, I must say. And this is where we need to invest a lot in trying to develop these understandings.
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry, I can't explain any further.
No, that gives me some clues on what to pursue now. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Raviji. Are there any other questions?
Could I also try
Yes,
and
please.
frame a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Dr. Bandyopadhyay, a wonderful lecture from you. Great to hear it. The question is arising from a statement which you made in this, that while the Western societies are on the path of restoration of their water systems, of their natural water systems, we are still continuing to barge down that alley of destruction. And you suggested that in time we would also go back to the path of restoration. But it seems to me that it may not always be possible to go back to the same route because of changes in many other conditions, because we are in an era of climate change. What do you think is likely to happen?
I think the infrastructure, any infrastructure for that matter, will have its own life. So there's a life cycle which you can expand with better management a little bit, but 50 years, 100 years, 150 years, how much more? So there is a fixed lifetime over which an infrastructure can function. And then it becomes much more difficult to manage that infrastructure. And maybe by that time, you find alternatives. And the value of a free flowing river, for instance, in the US, the value of trout fishing is more than the value of a multi-purpose dam, for instance. So that's one thing that happens. The second is the type of infrastructure that you see along the Missouri, Mississippi, the floodplain reclamations. So a lot of these floodplains which were built up at one point of time are being taken out. And if you are talking about climate change, this brings me directly back into the same question that I was raising, that it is about resilience. It is about our knowledge of how to hedge bets on trying to understand the small differences versus the large differences, rather than thinking that I'm completely protected because I have this which is going to help me forever. No. How do we build? We were a resilient society. We took occasional knocks, and that is the reason I was saying this is a high risk, high gain society. So now we are becoming comfortable because this is going to save us from all floods. Are we being saved? Are we not seeing things happening in Chennai, in Mumbai, in any other urban space? So the more we try to eliminate floods, just like trying to eliminate poverty, yes, the goalpost changes, the bars change, the whole ideas change. How are we going to adopt a kind of a confrontationist thing? Better than that, my view, as you asked me, is to work with nature rather than against nature. So try and see how we can become a part of the natural processes, how we can mold ourselves to absorb some of these knocks. So we do it regularly in the economic space. Why can't we do it in the ecologic space? We have to bend. We have to become much more resilient when dealing with the natural systems.
Right. Thank you. I think just to follow up from that is a comment from Manoj Mishra ji, that is probably better to learn from their mistakes than learning after committing those same mistakes. There's a question from Alka ji, who says, "Thank you for a wonderful lecture. Please explain further when you mentioned ordinary floods and the floods that could be called a disaster."
Oh, that's a bit arbitrary, I must concede, but and it's also a little bit intuitive. But it's also the question of the these are points that has to be understood, that whenever there is a flow, there will be peak flows, there would be low floods, there would be high floods. The pulses are going to be different, and our responses has to be different. And that is the reason I think what that brings us back to the whole idea of the zoning laws, the proposed or the draft zoning laws. If we are able to think in terms of zones, okay, a flood of this magnitude will inundate up to this point. So we create, these are water, and this is going to, we can actually demarcate lines to which the water is going to go up. So if the zones are delineated, and then there could be even markets that can help, because your insurance premium will be adjusting accordingly. So there are some parts could be no-go zones, some part could be go zones, but you will pay a higher premium. So there is a mix of legal and economic instruments that can work in favor of a river zoning system. So in a country where we do not even have a proper coastal zoning system, I see this a very difficult situation, in spite of the Supreme Court telling time and again.
Right. Thank you. We don't have any questions in the chat, but just to ask you, or just to discuss this point a bit further about what you mentioned regarding a mix of ecology and economy and law on where it can take us. Could us as the people who are involved in working with rivers work towards making this idea more prominent in the heads of people running insurance companies? Could that by default set up a zoning policy within the insurance framework that changes economics?
Absolutely, absolutely. We are in that direction. We are headed in that direction. So as we think of insurances for various kinds of things, I think property insurances are picking up. And property insurances, if we think of property insurances, there has to be a lot of database that gets created. So what are the risk factors? And floods are a very prominent risk factor. So and it can be mapped. So this is one way of creating databases. This is one way of pushing people to take calculated risks. So a lot of things can happen. It's a very promising area to work in.
Right. We have a question from Arun Dixit, who says, as an ecologist, how do you view the campaign on rights of rivers?
Rights of rivers. I don't know. Arun, you should tell me. Because at the end of the day, this is again, I don't know. This is the rights perspective is again, it is coming from somewhere in New Zealand, I think, where a river had been given the status of an individual. So the way Indian societies have looked at rivers as individuals is a little more metaphorical, is a little more personal. You look at it as a family member. You learn to adjust to its mood swings. It's not about, it's like a family member. So the rights of a family member is the same rights. So you cohabit, you work together. It's not something that this is not a transactional relationship. So it is a kind of a relationship that is much more deeply embedded in ecological bonding. And unfortunately, some of these bonds are breaking now, but that's where we are.
I'd like to follow up on that if I'm allowed.
Yes, please.
You know, we treat them as devis, as goddesses, except for a few like Brahmaputra. And then we go and dam them. Three-letter spelling as well as the four-letter spelling. Okay. I'm going to recall your comment that Brij Gopalji would have a one-word answer: educate. And I think that is a missing link in our higher education. For all engineering students, we begin our first year by studying maths, physics, chemistry. Everything else is optional. I think ecology has to be brought in at the same level as maths, physics, and chemistry. Newton's laws tell us about the physical world, the laws of the physical world. The laws of thermodynamics tell us about the laws of processes, more about chemistry. We need to learn the ecological laws just as well so that we understand how the biological world works. And you being at Nalanda University could possibly push for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. We do actually in Nalanda, and one of our former students is listening to this. Tatsama is there. We do try and attempt to create an interdisciplinary curriculum where we take students from whatever background and take them through the physical sciences, biological sciences, social sciences, economics, legal, and all of these we expose them to, and then look at issues and how do we create a vocabulary, how do we create a perspective around these issues, looking at it from various dimensions, particularly realizing the fact that the problems could be analyzed through one sectoral understanding, whereas often the problems required to be solved by transcending those domains and going and looking at it from other perspectives, bringing in other ideas. So just like what you said, if it is an engineer, if he or she has never understood the biological working, it is not going to, it's wrong to expect that person to actually come up and do something. Then in that case, the wetlands become wastelands.
May I come in for a while?
Yes, Manojji.
First of all, Professor Bandyopadhyay, it's wonderful lecture, really full of excellent thoughts. I would just seek your guidance in a scenario. You see, today as a society, we are actually confronted with a situation where fakery, where fakeness, where untruth is being actually pendered as the truth. And it is being done purposefully by different sections of not just society, but also the state. Like you mentioned about Ken Betwa, kind of getting some kind of a approval or some kind of agreement between the two states just today. And you actually did mention that this is some ways it is a way forward. It's a societal decision that we are trying to make. Whether it is right or wrong, we will face in future. But the fact remains that the things that have been actually presented to the Supreme Court to adjudicate and what is now being talked about are a total variance. Supreme Court has been told something different, but the public is being told something very different. So in such a scenario, how does one go about really educating the masses? Sorry, it's become quite a longest question, but please help me.
Manojji, I'm not in a position to answer this. This is what Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore said, that the words need to emerge from the depth of wisdom. I don't know how character and has to be linked with the communication. So communication is basically a question of trust and character, and a trust on the character of the individual who is communicating. So, and this is something which is a far more complex thing. I do not know really the entire system. Maybe Raviji might tell us something more about this.
No, I would throw up my hands also, except that in such difficult situations, I always recall the song from Boot Polish, in which, you remember that song, Nanne Munne Bacche Teri Mutti Mein Kya Hai? One line in that is, Badlega Zamana Ye Sitaron Mein Likha Hai. And I firmly believe that. So, to the earlier comment of Manoj, that why do we have to make the mistakes and not learn from the others? I think there's a certain element of human nature that we learn by making our own mistakes. It's very hard to learn from somebody else's mistakes. You have to be extremely wise to do that. Sorry, I can't answer anything else.
Thank you, Raviji. Vinay, do you have a question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, sir, very good evening. I'm Dr. Vinay from IIT Jammu, faculty of IIT Jammu. So, I have been also working, in the technical part like hydraulics, morphology, river engineering works of the rivers. So that way, I always keep understanding, understanding the hydraulics is one part, and integrating the hydraulics with the ecology of the river system is another part. So I just would like to ask you, how the floodplain vegetation could be helpful for improving the ecological condition of the river system. Could you please, give me your thought on this?
See, I think you have to ask the right questions. How is the vegetation going to improve the hydrology, or whether the hydrology will determine the type of vegetation and other life forms, right? So,
yes, please.
Isn't it? So, in a way, if you look at the literature on the e-flows, the whole idea is around that the hydrological regimes or the flows has to, or the alteration in the flows has to be mapped against the type of habitats that get created or are getting destroyed. So what is the quality of the habitats? That's number one. And that's the type of measures that underpin any of the 200 odd ways in which e-flows are measured or e-flows are calculated. So that's the guiding principle. And why is that the guiding principle? Because the nature of these hydrological components, so whether it is the duration, the amplitude, the frequency, or the timing of the flooding, all of these different components of flood will determine the nature of species and how they align with their life histories. So, and the more complex the life form, the more difficult is the life histories. So if you are going to larger plants and larger animals, then the requirements are even more stringent. So it is a kind of a trade-off. So where as a society we create that trade-off between the hydrologic alteration and the ecologic alteration. That's the kind of a game that we are in. And of course, this is something which is a very valid thing that you are looking at, because this is going to emerge as the next paradigm of water management, particularly river water management. Globally, it has come.
Because why I was asking this, even if I look at the corridors of the river Thavi in Jammu or river Brahmaputra in Assam, you can find out so much of vegetation cover on the floodplains. So most of the times we consider the vegetation as a nuisance when it is present in the channels, considering about the flood risk. But then what I have also been conducting this satellite imagery analysis and then followed by experimental things. There is a complex interaction that happens between the flow and the floodplain vegetation. So that influences the sediment transport, that influences the nutrient exchange, that influences the plant form stability of the rivers. Okay. So that way, I just would like to know more how fishes, what is the behavior of the aquatic fishes or any living organisms which are present in those specific zones. So that way, thanks for giving me some idea on this. So thank you.
Thank you for your
Just
question.
one more point I would like to mention here, that if you think in terms of the changed environment, often what happens is you will see an influx of what we call the weed species. These are the alien kind of plants like the water hyacinth, which will come up and cover the whole place. And then we say that this is an undesirable thing. But this undesirable thing is happening because there is an undesirable underlying factor, which is the altered hydrologic regime. Right? So if we think in those ways, then we understand that the problem is not the weed. The problem is what is allowing the weed to establish itself. Then your ecological understanding will come into the right perspective. Otherwise, you are on the wrong track.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Professor Bandyopadhyay. Some brilliant insights for all of us to learn from. So this marks the end of our question and answer session. We have a small session now where Manu Bhatnagarji from INTAC will share about this new monograph that has been created at INTAC, which is called a monograph on the lakes of Delhi. So I'll hand over the space to Manuji to talk about it. And I'll quickly share my screen to show you the cover for the monograph, and then Manuji can further talk about it. Yeah. Manuji?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. I'll begin then. All right.
Yes.
Okay. So basically, today has been a day of several water-related functions, And in quite a few of them, the speaker spoke about the more than 1,000 water bodies of Delhi. But the fact is that on the ground, there are only perhaps 400 or so. And most of these are village ponds. So where does, in terms of definition, a lake begin and a pond end? Or when does a pond become a lake? So I thought to myself, what could be the answer to this? And I believe that it's probably, there's not much of a difference in terms of principles, but certainly in terms of scale, there may be a difference. When you see a large water body, you call it a lake. And as it goes down in size, perhaps, you would think of it as a water body or as a pond. Now, so out of these 400 plus, water bodies, I have tried to isolate 35 of them, which could possibly be called lakes. And in the context of Delhi, these water bodies are not really very large. So, the smallest of the selected water bodies as lakes is about 2 hectares, which perhaps in, scale is fairly small. But on the largest side, we have at the moment Balaswa Lake, which is extant and which is around, about 45 hectares or half a square kilometer, somewhat equal in size to Nainital. Now, what is actually different about this monograph or why we did it? Actually, for the last few years or almost 2.5 decades, INTAC has been working on water issues and particularly in Delhi. Delhi has been our laboratory. And we have accumulated a whole lot of material which I find is not readily available in the public domain. And even with many of the government agencies from whom we originally took some of the documents, even they are unable to locate these documents in their archives easily. So what we have done is we have tried to, for each water body, we have put in a series of maps. In the case of Najafgarh Jheel, the first map is dated 1803. But in most cases, we have looked at the Survey of India map 1911, 1936, the survey of 1956, 64, 84, 95, 2010. So we have assembled these for most of these selected lakes. And they show how the basin characteristics have changed over time from free, open, rustic or forested basins to highly densely urbanized catchments, which have completely affected and changed their flow characteristics and also affected the water quality in those lakes. We have also given the groundwater table maps, which show the areas where the water table has gone down, although we are not able readily to make a connection with the water volume available in the lakes and connect that to the groundwater maps. But we have made an attempt on that also. In many cases, we have given solutions where we have worked them out in detail, or where possibly solutions can be worked out based on the data given. Many of these lakes, they act as flood moderators. They certainly act as carbon sinks in the city, and they also enable us to recycle water. Here I'll give an example of the Haus Khas Lake, where when we revived that lake, it was based upon and is still based upon the treated sewage of Vasant Kunj STP. Now, when we did that, a lot of people were very worked up that you are introducing, this sewage in our lakes. But anyway, we battled that issue. We got it through. And we have got the groundwater samples tested way back in 2003, again in 2013, and again in 2018. And there has been no change in the water quality in the aquifer. And in fact, I can readily say that with some chlorination treatment, it is potable water because the soil filtration also has a great impact. Now, the lesson over here is that although there's a lot of talk about recycling wastewater to households, we all know there's a great reluctance and it will not be practical. It will not actually happen. But now, in this case of Hoskas, what is happening is that all the posh colonies around are exploiting that water table. They are extracting groundwater, which is reaching to them through the lake. Okay. But with that change of source in their mind, that is now it is groundwater. So it makes possible the existence of these lakes in the city, makes possible the recycling of water in in an acceptable manner. I would also like to add that the lakes contribute to SDG 6, SDG 11, and I would also say that lakes in a city completely change the texture of the harsh, concretized urban spaces. They also add value by being psychological de-stressants. So with this monograph, we have tried to put the larger lakes of Delhi in the public domain and hope that the monograph will be useful in reviving those which are available to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuji. For everyone here, I have put a link to the file in the chat here. The monograph is also accessible via the India Rivers Forum website, which is hosted at the link that I've posted now. Both of these links will also be sent by email to all the participants who had registered for this event. So thank you, Manuji, for sharing with us this work that INTAC has done, and hopefully it will bring more attention to the lakes of Delhi and other cities. And
Thank you,
that,
Sudha.
yes. So with that, I think we are through with the proceedings for the day. For all here, I would request to keep in touch with India Rivers Forum's network. You can sign up for updates on our website, indiariversforum.org. And we will be doing more sessions in the coming days. So if you sign up to that to our website, we will send you updates as well. So thank you, Professor Somnath, for your very insightful lecture. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you, everyone.